The red sun of Solara 7 was setting, casting long shadows across the abandoned cityscape. Zara, a young Xilarian female, stood atop a crumbling tower, her 4 eyes scanning the horizon. Her slender body, covered in iridescent scales, trembled slightly in the cooling air. But it wasn't the chill that made her shiver. It was the overwhelming sense of loneliness and fear. Just 3 days ago, this city had been bustling with life. The Xilarians, a peaceful race of highly intelligent beings, had lived here for millennia. But then the humans came. The war had been swift and brutal. The technologically superior Earth forces had decimated the Xilarian defenses in a matter of weeks. Zara closed her eyes, remembering the chaos of the evacuation. The screams, the panic, the rush to reach the last of the spacefaring vessels. She had been there, pushing through the crowd, her hand clasped tightly in her mother's grasp. They had made it to the ship, or so she thought. In the confusion of the boarding process, Zara had been separated from her family. She remembered being shoved into a small pod, thinking it was part of the larger ship. The door had sealed, and she felt the lurch of takeoff. But something had gone wrong. A malfunction, a glitch in the system. Instead of joining the fleet, her pod had been jettisoned back to the surface. By the time she managed to free herself from the crashed pod, the Xilarian fleet was gone. Nothing but contrails in the sky remained of her people. Now, as the last light faded from the sky, Zara felt truly alone for the first time in her young life. She was barely an adult by Xilarian standards, equivalent to a human teenager. She had never been on her own before, always surrounded by the communal lifestyle of her people. Zara climbed down from the tower, her 3-fingered hands finding easy purchase on the familiar architecture. She needed to find food and shelter for the night. The city was eerily quiet, devoid of the usual hum of machinery and chatter of its inhabitants. Her footsteps echoed off the empty buildings as she made her way to what was once the central market. The market, usually a vibrant place full of colors and smells, was now a ghost town. Abandoned stalls stood with their wares still on display, now covered in a fine layer of dust. Zara picked her way through, gathering what edible items she could find. The Xilarian diet consisted mainly of a variety of fungi and synthesized proteins, most of which could last for weeks without spoiling. As she stuffed her finds into a discarded bag, a sound made her freeze. It was distant but unmistakable. The low rumble of engines. Human engines. They were coming back. Panic gripped Zara's heart. Why were they returning? To colonize? To strip the planet of resources? Or worse, to hunt down any Xilarians left behind? She needed to hide, and fast. Zara's mind raced through her options. The underground transit system. It was vast and complex, easy to get lost in if you didn't know your way. And she knew every tunnel like the back of her hand. Clutching her bag of supplies, Zara sprinted towards the nearest transit entrance. The familiar whoosh of the automatic doors was absent. She had to pry them open manually. As she descended the stairs, the rumble of engines grew louder. The transit station was dark, emergency lights casting an eerie blue glow throughout the space. Zara made her way to the maintenance tunnels, areas restricted to the public but well known to her. Her father had been a transit engineer, and he had often brought her along on his rounds. As she squeezed through a narrow passage, Zara felt a pang of grief. Where was her father now? Her mother? Her little sibling who had just undergone their first molt? Were they safe among the stars, or had they too fallen victim to some cruel twist of fate? Zara pushed the thoughts aside. She couldn't afford to break down now. She needed to stay alert, to survive. She found a small alcove, hidden behind a tangle of pipes and wires. It would do for now. As she settled in, the distant sound of human voices echoed through the tunnels. They were here, in the city. Zara held her breath, pressing herself further into her hiding spot. She didn't know much about humans, only what she had learned in school and from the brief, terrifying encounters during the war. They were ruthless, aggressive, and now they were here, on her world. In the darkness of the maintenance tunnel, Zara made a promise to herself. She would survive. She would find a way off this planet, and somehow, someday, she would reunite with her people. But for now, all she could do was wait, hope, and stay hidden as the human invaders prowled above. Sergeant Jake Miller wiped the sweat from his brow as he stepped out of the human transport ship. The air on Xelara 7 was thick and humid, making his combat suit feel even more uncomfortable. He looked around at the alien cityscape, a mix of awe and sadness in his eyes. "All right, team," he called out to his squad. "Remember, this is a cleanup mission. We're here to gather intel and secure any leftover Xelarian tech. Keep your eyes open, but weapons down. We don't expect any resistance." As his team spread out, Jake couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. The war had been quick and decisive, but was it necessary? He had joined the Earth Defense Force to protect humanity, not to conquer peaceful aliens. Jake made his way down what seemed to be a main street. The alien architecture was beautiful, all sweeping curves and iridescent materials. It was a far cry from the utilitarian designs of human cities. He activated his scanner, searching for any signs of advanced technology. As he turned a corner, his scanner beeped. Something was moving in a building nearby. Jake's heart raced. Could it be a leftover Xelarian? Protocol dictated that he should report it immediately, but something made him hesitate. He approached the building cautiously, his hand hovering over his weapon. As he entered, he heard a soft sound, like someone trying to stifle a sob. Following the noise, he found himself in what looked like a living area. There, huddled in a corner, was a young Xelarian. She looked up at him with 4 wide, terrified eyes. Jake froze, unsure of what to do. The alien was clearly not a threat. She looked young and scared. "Hey," Jake said softly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The Xelarian didn't respond, just pressed herself further into the corner. Jake's mind raced. He should call this in, but he knew what would happen if he did. The alien would be captured, studied, maybe even dissected. He couldn't bear the thought. Making a split-second decision, Jake reached up and removed his helmet. He wanted the alien to see his face, to see that he was just as vulnerable as she was. "My name is Jake," he said, pointing to himself. "Jake, can you understand me?" The Xelarian blinked, then slowly nodded. Jake felt a surge of relief. At least they could communicate on some level. "Are you alone?" he asked, miming looking around for others. The alien nodded again, a look of sadness crossing her features. Jake's heart went out to her. She must have been left behind during the evacuation. "Listen," Jake said, his voice low and urgent. "It's not safe for you here. My people, they won't understand. They might hurt you. I want to help." The Xelarian tilted her head, confusion evident in her alien features. Jake knew he was taking a huge risk, but he couldn't just leave her here. "Come with me," he said, holding out his hand. "I'll hide you, keep you safe." For a long moment, the alien just stared at his outstretched hand. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. Her skin was cool and smooth, unlike anything Jake had felt before. Just then, Jake's comm crackled to life. "Sergeant Miller, report in. Have you found anything?" Jake's heart pounded. He looked at the alien, then back at his comm. "Negative, Captain," he lied. "This sector is clear. No signs of life or valuable tech." "Roger that. Finish your sweep and return to the ship." Jake let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He turned back to the Xelarian, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and hope. "Okay," he said, more to himself than to her. "We can do this. I'm going to get you out of here." As they snuck out of the building, Jake's mind was racing. He was betraying his mission, risking his career, maybe even committing treason. But looking at the scared alien by his side, he knew he was doing the right thing. They made their way through the empty streets, Jake constantly on alert for his fellow soldiers. He led the Xilarian to an abandoned warehouse he had noticed earlier, far from where the human ships had landed. "Stay here," he told her, miming hiding. "I'll come back with food and supplies. You'll be safe." As Jake turned to leave, he felt a hand on his arm. The Xilarian was looking at him, her alien features somehow conveying gratitude. "Zara," she said haltingly, pointing to herself. Jake smiled. "Zara," he repeated. "I'll be back, Zara. I promise." As he walked away, heading back to report to his captain, Jake knew his life had just changed forever. He was no longer just a soldier following orders. He was a protector, a friend to an alien in need, and somehow he knew this was just the beginning of an incredible journey. The abandoned warehouse creaked and groaned in the alien wind. Zara huddled in a corner, her large eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. She had been here for 3 days now, surviving on the supplies Jake had managed to smuggle to her. Every sound made her jump, fearing discovery by the other humans. The door creaked open, and Zara tensed. But it was just Jake, his arms full of more supplies. He smiled as he saw her, and Zara felt a strange warmth in her chest. This human was so different from the others she had seen during the war. "Hey, Zara," Jake said softly, setting down his load. "How are you doing today?" Zara tilted her head, still struggling to understand his words. But his tone was kind, and she was starting to recognize certain sounds. She pointed to herself and then gave a thumbs up, mimicking a gesture she had seen Jake use. Jake laughed, a sound that startled Zara at first, but soon had her making a chirping noise that was the Xilarian equivalent of laughter. "Good, you're learning," Jake said, sitting down across from her. "Let's try something new today." He pulled out a datapad and showed it to Zara. On the screen was a simple picture of a human stick figure. Jake pointed to it, and then to himself. "Human," he said clearly. Zara's eyes widened in understanding. She repeated the word, her alien vocal cords struggling with the unfamiliar sounds. "Human," Jake nodded encouragingly. Then he pulled up a new image, this time of a stick figure with 4 eyes and a tail. "Xilarian," he said, pointing to Zara. "Xilarian," Zara repeated, more confidently this time. She pointed to herself and chirped something in her own language. Jake grinned. "That's right. You're a Xilarian, and I'm a human." Over the next few hours, they went through more words. Food, water, ship, star. Basic concepts that they could illustrate with pictures. Zara was a quick learner, her alien mind easily grasping the patterns of human language. As they worked, Jake found himself fascinated by Zora's alien mannerisms. The way her scales shifted color slightly with her emotions, the graceful movements of her 3-fingered hands. He had been taught to see the Xilarians as enemies, but sitting here with Zora, he could only see a person. Different, yes, but a thinking, feeling being nonetheless. "Jake," Zara said suddenly, breaking his reverie. She pointed to the door and made a walking motion with her fingers. Jake understood immediately. "You want to go outside." "It's not safe, Zara." The other humans. But Zara was insistent. She minded going crazy, her hands waving around her head. Jake couldn't help but laugh. Okay. I get it. You're going stir-crazy in here, but we have to be careful." He thought for a moment, then had an idea. "Wait here," he said, holding up a hand in the stay gesture they had practiced. Jake left and returned a few minutes later with a large cloth. Carefully, he draped it over Zara, covering her alien features. It wasn't perfect, but in the dim light of dusk, it might just pass. "Come on," he said, offering his hand. "Let's go for a quick walk." They stepped out into the alien twilight. Zora's eyes widened beneath her makeshift hood as she took in the city. Her city, now eerily quiet and filled with human vehicles and equipment. As they walked, Jake pointed out different things, naming them in English. Zara absorbed it all, occasionally offering the Xilarian word in return. It was a strange language lesson, conducted in whispers as they crept through the shadows of a conquered city. Suddenly, voices approached. Jake pulled Zara into a narrow alley, his heart pounding. Two human soldiers walked by, deep in conversation. Zara trembled against him, and Jake instinctively put an arm around her. "It's okay," he whispered. "They're gone now." Zara looked up at him, her alien eyes filled with trust. In that moment, Jake knew he would do anything to keep her safe. As they made their way back to the warehouse, Jake's mind was racing. He couldn't keep Zara hidden forever. Sooner or later, someone would find out. He needed a plan, a way to get her off planet. But for now, as he watched Zora excitedly pointing out constellations in the alien sky, naming them in her language, Jake felt a sense of peace. They were from different worlds, separated by a war neither of them fully understood. But here, in this quiet moment, none of that mattered. They were just two beings, learning to understand each other, forming an unlikely alliance that might just change everything. 2 weeks had passed since Jake first found Zora. Their secret meetings had become the highlight of both their days. Jake's fellow soldiers had started to notice his frequent disappearances, but so far, he had managed to keep Zara hidden. One evening, as Jake snuck into the warehouse with fresh supplies, he found Zora hunched over a pile of scrap metal and wires. "What's this?" Jake asked, curious. Zora looked up, her eyes shining with excitement. "Communicator," she said slowly, proud of her improving English. Jake's eyes widened as he realized what she was building. "A communicator? Zara, that's brilliant. But who are you trying to contact?" Zara's expression turned sad. She pointed up at the sky. "Home," she said simply. Jake felt a pang in his heart. Of course, Zara would want to find her people, but the thought of her leaving made him unexpectedly sad. Their moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Jake quickly hid Zara behind some crates and moved to intercept the intruder. To his horror, it was Corporal Alex Reed, one of the more aggressive soldiers in his unit. "Sergeant Miller," Reed said, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. "Fancy meeting you here. Again." Jake tried to keep his voice calm. "Just doing some extra recon, Corporal. What brings you here?" Reed circled the warehouse, his eyes scanning every corner. "Funny thing, Sarge. Some of the boys have noticed you sneaking off. Got me wondering what's so interesting about this old building." Jake's heart raced. He could see Zora's frightened eyes peeking out from behind the crates. If Reed turned just a little more. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. Zara had knocked over a stack of metal pipes, creating a distraction. Reed whirled around, his hand on his weapon. "What was that?" he demanded. Jake thought fast. "Probably just some local wildlife. This place is falling apart after all." Reed didn't look convinced. "Wildlife, huh? Let's check it out." As Reed moved toward Zora's hiding spot, Jake made a split-second decision. He grabbed a piece of debris and hit it against a nearby wall, creating another loud noise in the opposite direction. "Over there," Jake shouted, pointing away from Zora. Reed hesitated, then moved to investigate the new sound. Jake used the moment to silently signal Zora to stay hidden. After a tense few minutes of searching, Reed finally seemed satisfied. "Guess you were right about the wildlife, Sarge. But I've got my eye on you. Something's not right here." As Reed left, Jake let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Zora emerged from her hiding spot, trembling. "That was close," Jake said, his voice shaky. "Too close." Zora nodded, her scales shifting to a pale color that Jake had learned meant fear. "Danger," she said softly. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "We need a better plan. We can't keep hiding you here forever." Just then, Zora's makeshift communicator began to beep. Both of them froze, staring at the device. "It works?" Jake asked, amazed. Zora nodded excitedly, her fear forgotten. She adjusted some dials, and suddenly a scratchy voice came through. It was speaking in the Solarian language, but Jake could tell from Zara's reaction that it was important. "What is it?" he asked. Zara's eyes were wide with a mix of excitement and fear. "My people," she said. "Coming back. Rescue." Jake felt a confusing mix of emotions. He was happy for Zara, but the thought of her leaving made his chest tight. And if the Solarians were coming back, it could mean another war. "When?" he asked urgently. Zara listened to the transmission for a moment longer. 3 days, she replied. Jake's mind raced. 3 days. They had 3 days to figure out how to get Zara to her people without starting another conflict. And he had 3 days left with her. As if sensing his turmoil, Zara reached out and took his hand. "Jake, help?" she asked, her alien eyes full of trust. Jake squeezed her hand, pushing aside his conflicting emotions. "Of course I'll help," he said. "We're in this together." As they began to plan, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that their problems were just beginning. With Reed suspicious, the Solarians returning, and his own growing feelings for Zara, the next 3 days promised to be the most challenging of his life. But looking at Zara's determined face, Jake knew he wouldn't have it any other way. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The next 2 days passed in a blur of secret meetings and frantic planning. Jake and Zara knew they had only one chance to get this right. The Solarian rescue ship was due to arrive in less than 24 hours, and they needed to be ready. Jake had managed to sneak away some communication equipment from the human base. He and Zara worked tirelessly to modify it, combining it with her homemade communicator to create a device that could send a coded message to the incoming Solarian ship. As the sun set on the second day, Jake entered the warehouse, his face grim. "Bad news," he said. "Reed's convinced the captain to do a full sweep of the city tomorrow. We're out of time." Zara's scales paled with fear. "What we do?" she asked, her English still broken but improving. Jake took a deep breath. "We move tonight. I've got a plan, but it's risky." He unrolled a map of the city on the floor. "There's an old Solarian ship in the scrapyard here," he pointed. "It's damaged, but I think we can get it flying." "Barely." Zara's eyes widened. "You fly Solarian ship?" Jake grinned nervously. "How hard can it be? But first, we need to get there without being seen." As night fell, Jake and Zara put their plan into action. Jake had borrowed some equipment from the base: night vision goggles, communication devices, and most importantly, a security pass that would get them into the scrapyard. They moved silently through the empty streets, Jake constantly on alert for patrols. Zara followed close behind, her alien senses picking up things Jake missed. As they neared the scrapyard, Jake's comm crackled to life. "All units, be advised. We have reports of unusual activity in Sector 7. All available personnel report in." Jake cursed under his breath. Sector 7 was where they were heading. Someone must have spotted them. "Change of plans," he whispered to Zara. "We're going to have to run for it." Just then, a spotlight illuminated them. "Halt!" a voice boomed. "Identify yourselves." Jake grabbed Zara's hand. "Run." They sprinted towards the scrapyard, alarms blaring behind them. Jake swiped his security pass at the gate, praying it would work. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then the gate slowly began to open. Come on," Jake muttered. The gap was barely wide enough when they squeezed through. Inside the scrapyard was a maze of defunct ships and machinery. Jake led them through, relying on his memory of the layout. Behind them, they could hear shouts and the sound of the gate being forced open. Finally, they reached the Solarian ship. It was smaller than Jake had remembered, its once sleek surface now dented and dirty. "Can you get it started?" Jake asked Zara. She nodded, her hands already moving over the ship's external controls. The ship hummed to life, lights flickering on. "Freeze," a voice shouted. Jake turned to see Reed and a squad of soldiers, weapons raised. "Step away from the alien." "Sergeant," Reed ordered. "That's an order." Jake stood his ground, positioning himself between the guns and Zara. "I can't do that, Corporal." Reed's face twisted with anger. "I knew you were a traitor. Take them both down." Just then, the ship's engines roared to life. The sudden noise and wind threw the soldiers off balance. Jake used the distraction to shove Zara towards the ship's open hatch. "Go," he yelled. "I'll hold them off." But Zara grabbed his arm, her strength surprising him. "Together," she said firmly, pulling him into the ship. The hatch closed just as the first shots pinged off the hull. Zara's hands flew over the controls, and the ship lurched upwards. Jake strapped himself in, his heart pounding. "Do you know how to fly this thing?" Zara gave him a look that somehow managed to be both alien and exasperated. "Ike Solarian. Of course I fly." The ship shot into the night sky, leaving the shouts and shots far behind. As they broke through the atmosphere, Jake let out a whoop of joy and relief. But their celebration was short-lived. The ship's console began beeping urgently. "What's wrong?" Jake asked. Zara's face was grim. "Human ships, following." Jake looked out the viewport to see several Earth fighters in pursuit. Their small victory had been just the beginning. The real challenge was yet to come. As Zara maneuvered the ship through a hail of weapons fire, Jake realized that their great escape was far from over. But looking at the determined set of Zara's alien features, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The stolen Solarian ship shuddered as it entered the atmosphere of an unknown planet. Alarms blared, red lights flashing across the control panel. Jake gripped his seat, knuckles white, as Zara fought with the controls. "Can you land this thing?" Jake shouted over the noise. Zara's scales flickered with concentration. "Maybe. Hold tight." The ship plummeted through thick purple clouds. Jake's stomach lurched as they spun, the ground rushing up to meet them. At the last moment, Zara managed to level out, but the landing was still rough. They skidded across a field of what looked like blue grass, the ship groaning in protest. Finally, they came to a stop. Silence fell, broken only by their heavy breathing. "We alive," Zara said, a note of surprise in her voice. Jake let out a shaky laugh. "Yeah, we are. Nice flying." They stumbled out of the ship, taking in their surroundings. The sky was a deep lavender, 2 small suns hanging low on the horizon. The air was thick and humid, with a strange, sweet smell. "Any idea where we are?" Jake asked. Zara shook her head. "Not charted. Ship computer damaged in crash." Jake's military training kicked in. "Okay, first things first. We need to find water, food, and shelter." They salvaged what they could from the ship, some emergency rations, a few tools, and a device that Zara said could analyze the safety of local food and water. With the ship too damaged to fly, they set out to explore their new surroundings. The blue grass crunched under their feet as they walked. Strange, balloon-like creatures floated by, propelled by gentle gusts of wind. In the distance, they could see a forest of tall, spiral-shaped trees. As they neared the forest, Jake suddenly held up a hand, signaling Zara to stop. "Look," he whispered, pointing. Near the edge of the forest, a group of creatures was gathered around a pool of shimmering liquid. They were about waist-high to Jake, with 6 legs and bodies covered in what looked like shiny scales, not unlike Zara's. "Sentient?" Jake asked quietly. Zara studied the creatures intently. "Maybe. Seem organized." As they watched, one of the creatures approached the pool. It dipped a tendril into the liquid, then passed it to another creature, who seemed to absorb it somehow. "I think they're feeding each other," Jake said, fascinated. Zara nodded. "Social species. Like humans. Like Solarians." Suddenly, one of the creatures turned, its eye stalks swiveling towards them. It made a high-pitched trilling sound, and the entire group turned to face Jake and Zara. "Oh," Jake muttered. "What now?" Zara stepped forward slowly, her hands raised in what she hoped was a universal gesture of peace. She made a soft chirping sound, similar to the creature's trills. The creatures chittered amongst themselves. Then one approached cautiously. It extended a tendril toward Zora, offering a drop of the shimmering liquid. "Zara, wait," Jake said, concerned. "We don't know if that's safe." But Zara had already touched the tendril with one of her fingers. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Not drink," she said. "Information. They share memories." Jake watched in amazement as Zara and the creature seemed to communicate silently. After a few moments, Zara turned to him, excitement in her eyes. "They peaceful," she said. "Welcome us. Say we can stay." Jake felt a wave of relief. "That's great, but how are we going to survive here long term?" Zara gestured to the creatures. "They help. Teach us." Over the next few days, Jake and Zara learned to survive in their new environment. The creatures, which they started calling shapers due to their ability to manipulate the shimmering liquid into various tools, showed them which plants were safe to eat and how to find clean water. Jake found himself constantly amazed by this alien world. The spiral trees turned out to be an excellent source of a nutritious sap. The floating balloon creatures, when gently caught, provided a material stronger and more flexible than any fabric on Earth. Zora thrived in this new environment, her natural curiosity making her a quick learner. She spent hours communicating with the shapers, learning about their culture and history. One evening, as they sat watching the twin suns set, Jake turned to Zara. "You know, a part of me misses Earth. But another part, I think I could get used to this place." Zara nodded, her scales shimmering in the fading light. New world, new home. Together. Jake smiled, taking her hand in his. Together. As night fell and strange, bioluminescent creatures began to light up the forest, Jake realized that this alien world, with all its challenges and wonders, had given him something he never expected, a sense of belonging, and a partner to share it with. 6 months had passed since Jake and Zara crash-landed on the alien world they now called home. The purple sky and blue grass no longer seemed strange to Jake. The shapers, once mysterious creatures, were now friends and teachers. Jake stood at the edge of their settlement, looking out over the spiral forest. Zara approached, carrying a device they had built from parts of their crashed ship and materials provided by the shapers. "It ready," Zara said, her English much improved after months of practice with Jake. Jake took a deep breath. "Are you sure you want to do this? Once we send the message, everything could change." Zora's scales shimmered with determination. "We must try. For peace." They had spent weeks debating this decision. The device in Zora's hands was a long-range communicator, capable of sending a message to both Earth and Zora's homeworld. They hoped to open a dialogue, to prevent further conflict between humans and Silurians. Jake nodded, taking Zora's free hand in his. Together, they activated the device. "This is Sergeant Jake Miller of Earth and Zara of Solaris 7, Jake began. "We are broadcasting from a neutral planet, one that has shown us the possibility of peaceful coexistence between different species." Zara continued, her voice clear and strong. "We have learned that our differences need not divide us. There is room in the galaxy for both our peoples to thrive." They took turns explaining their story, the war, their unlikely friendship, their survival on this new world. They described the shapers and their culture of sharing and mutual support. "We propose a meeting," Jake said. "Here, on this neutral ground. Let representatives from Earth and Solaris 7 come and see what we have seen. Let us build bridges instead of armies." As the message ended, Jake and Zara looked at each other, a mix of hope and anxiety in their eyes. "Now we wait," Zara said softly. Days passed with no response. Jake and Zara tried to carry on with their daily routines, helping the shapers tend to their liquid memory pools and harvesting sap from the spiral trees. But the silence from their home worlds weighed heavily on them. Then, one morning, their communicator crackled to life. "This is Captain Sarah Chen of the Earth diplomatic vessel, Hope," the voice said. "We have received your message and are en route to your coordinates." Before Jake and Zara could react, another voice came through. "Greetings from the Solarian Council. We too have heard your call and are sending representatives." Jake and Zara hugged each other tightly, joy and relief washing over them. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. With the help of the Shapers, they prepared for the arrival of both delegations. They set up a neutral meeting ground, complete with translation devices they had built using Shaper technology. The day of the meeting arrived. Jake stood beside Zara as the Earth ship descended from the purple sky. Nearby, a Solarian vessel shimmered into view, its cloaking technology far superior to the human ship. As the delegates emerged, humans in their crisp uniforms, Solarians with their shimmering scales, Jake felt a moment of panic. What if this didn't work? What if they had just brought the war to this peaceful world? But then he felt Zara's hand in his, saw the curious and welcoming gestures of the Shapers, and his fears subsided. The human captain, Sarah Chen, approached first. "Sergeant Miller," she said, her voice a mix of respect and uncertainty. "You've given us quite a lot to think about." The Solarian representative, a tall, elegant being, spoke next. "Zara, child of Solaris 7, you have shown great courage in reaching out to us." Jake and Zara led the delegations to the meeting area. As they walked, the delegates couldn't help but marvel at the alien landscape and the peaceful Shapers. The negotiations were not easy. Years of mistrust and misunderstanding couldn't be erased in a day. But as the talks progressed, Jake and Zara saw something they had barely dared to hope for, understanding beginning to grow. The Shapers played a crucial role, their ability to share memories allowing the humans and Solarians to experience each other's perspectives in a way words alone never could. As the twin suns set on the final day of negotiations, Captain Chen and the Solarian representatives signed a preliminary peace accord. "This is just the beginning," Chen said. "But it's a good beginning." Jake and Zara looked at each other, their hearts full. They had done it. They had built a bridge between worlds. "What now?" Jake asked softly. Zara's scales shimmered with joy. "Now we keep building. Together." As they watched the delegates prepare to return to their ships, carrying messages of peace to their home worlds, Jake and Zara knew that their adventure was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning.